Fred Rogers stood up without saying a word. It was February 14th, 1980, 11:44 p.m. NBC Studios in Burbank. And the gentlest man in American television, a man who had spent 17 years absorbing criticism, mockery, and outright dismissal with a patience that seemed genuinely bottomless, walked calmly toward the stage exit while 21 million Americans sat in stunned silence, uncertain whether they had actually just watched what they thought they had watched. Truman Capote, still sitting in his chair, drink in hand, watched him go, with an expression that several people present described as somewhere between shock and dawning shame. Coming up, exactly what Truman Capote said that made Fred Rogers do something he had never done before or since in his entire public career. The specific childhood wound Capote's words had accidentally reopened, and what happened backstage in the 90 seconds after Rogers disappeared behind that curtain. But before we dive in, I see messages all the time in the comment section that some of you didn't realize you weren't subscribed. So if you could do me a favor and double check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's simple, it's free, and it's something anybody who watches this show frequently can do to help us keep everything going. Please do double check if you've subscribed, and thank you so much, because in a strange way, you're part of our history, and you're on this journey with us, and I appreciate you for that. Now let's get into what happened that night, because what almost nobody watching that broadcast understood was exactly why those particular words from that particular man were the one thing capable of finally breaking through 17 years of Fred Rogers' legendary composure. Truman Capote was born in New Orleans in 1924, and by the time he walked onto that Tonight Show stage in February of 1980, he had built one of the most celebrated and most self-destructive careers in American letters, a literary reputation founded on genuine brilliance, the author of In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's, alongside a public persona that had, over the preceding decade, curdled into something considerably darker. A man whose once dazzling wit had increasingly become a vehicle for cruelty, fueled by an addiction to alcohol and prescription medication that had, by 1980, left him barely recognizable to the friends who had known him during his years of genuine literary triumph. His childhood had been marked by a specific and profound abandonment that he rarely discussed with anything resembling emotional honesty, a mother who found him inconvenient and left him for extended periods with relatives in Alabama, a father largely absent from his life, a boy who learned early that the surest way to be noticed in a house that did not particularly want him was to be clever, cutting, and impossible to ignore. This childhood strategy became, across 5 decades, his entire relationship to other human beings, a conviction that wit deployed without mercy was the only currency that guaranteed attention, and by 1980, that conviction had metastasized into something that had already cost him nearly every meaningful friendship he had built across his literary career, following the publication of excerpts from an unfinished novel that had betrayed the private confidences of the wealthy socialites who had once considered him their closest friend. The specific circumstances of that betrayal deserve fuller documentation because they illuminate the exact pattern of self-destruction that had brought Capote to that Tonight Show stage in a state so visibly diminished from his years of literary triumph. In 1975, Capote had published a chapter from a long-promised and ultimately unfinished novel in Esquire magazine, a chapter that thinly fictionalized the private confessions of several wealthy women who had spent years treating him as their most trusted confidant, sharing infidelities and family scandals and private griefs with a man they believed had earned that trust through genuine friendship. Capote's betrayal of these confidences, rendered in prose sharp enough to make the real identities of his subjects immediately obvious to anyone in their social circle, produced a swift and total exile from the exact world that had given his life its glittering social structure for nearly 2 decades. Women who had once fought for his company at their most exclusive gatherings stopped returning his calls entirely, and Capote, according to people who knew him during this period, seemed genuinely bewildered by the completeness of his own social destruction, unable to understand why people who had loved his wit when it was directed at others suddenly found it considerably less charming once it had been turned, with such precision, against themselves. This specific and total isolation, arriving in the years immediately preceding his Tonight Show appearance with Fred Rogers, had intensified both his drinking and the particular bitterness that increasingly characterized his public appearances. A man who had lost nearly everything that once made his life feel meaningful, and who had, in the process, become considerably more dangerous to anyone unfortunate enough to sit across from him with a camera rolling. What almost nobody outside Fred Rogers' closest professional circle understood in 1980 was the specific and considerable cost of maintaining the gentle, endlessly patient public persona that had made him one of the most trusted figures in American television. This cost manifested in specific and consistent ways that only those closest to him ever witnessed, according to accounts given by longtime members of his production staff. He would, on occasion, retreat to his office after a particularly cutting piece of press coverage and remain there alone for 20 or 30 minutes before resuming his usual warm engagement with cast and crew, a brief private period that staff members eventually learned to recognize and to respect without comment, understanding that even a man of Rogers' remarkable emotional discipline required occasional space to absorb criticism before returning to the public version of himself the world expected. He never discussed the content of these private moments, maintaining, even with people who worked alongside him for years, a specific boundary around exactly how much the mockery actually affected him personally. Rogers had, by this point, absorbed nearly 2 decades of public mockery from critics and comedians who found his sincerity an easy and reliable target. Impressions and parodies built around the assumption that no adult could genuinely be as kind and as patient as Fred Rogers appeared to be on camera, that the persona had to be, at some level, a performance. Rogers had developed, across those years, a remarkable and specific discipline for absorbing this mockery without visible injury, understanding, with the professional clarity of a man who had studied child development formally, that defending himself too vigorously would only confirm, for skeptical audiences, that the criticism had found a genuine target worth protecting. He had built, in other words, an entire professional posture around never appearing wounded by cynicism, regardless of how deeply any particular criticism actually landed. What Rogers had never publicly discussed, in any interview across his entire career, was the specific reason this particular kind of accusation, the suggestion that his gentleness was calculated rather than genuine, carried a weight that went considerably beyond ordinary professional criticism. Rogers' own childhood had been shaped by a specific and formative loneliness. A sickly, overweight boy frequently confined to his room by illness, bullied when he was well enough to attend school, and it was during this childhood isolation that young Fred had discovered puppetry, building an entire private world of invented characters through which he processed feelings the adults around him rarely had the patience or the vocabulary to address directly. This childhood experience had taught him, with a specificity that shaped the entire remainder of his professional life, exactly how much genuine damage could be done to a child who came to believe that the adults around them were performing care rather than actually feeling it, and exactly how much it could cost a lonely child to discover that the kindness they had trusted completely was, in fact, calculated and false. There is a specific memory from Rogers' own childhood that he described, in fragments, to exactly one biographer late in his life, a memory that illuminates precisely why the accusation of manufactured kindness carried such devastating weight for him personally. As a young boy confined to bed for extended periods by illness, Rogers had developed a particular attachment to a household staff member who spent considerable time caring for him during his mother's frequent absences, a woman whose warmth toward him he experienced as genuinely maternal in a way his own relationship with his birth mother, by his own later careful description, did not always provide. When young Fred was around 9 years old, he overheard this same staff member, believing herself unobserved, describing her patience with him to another adult in starkly transactional terms, framing her attentiveness as simply the requirements of her paid position rather than anything resembling genuine affection. Rogers never fully recovered, according to his biographer, from the specific vertigo of discovering that warmth he had experienced as completely real had been, at least in that woman's own private accounting, simply a professional service rendered for compensation. He carried this experience forward into his entire adult understanding of what children actually needed from the adults responsible for their care, an unshakable conviction that the distinction between performed kindness and genuine kindness mattered enormously to a child's developing sense of whether the world could be trusted at all, and that this distinction was worth defending with everything he had. This is precisely why Truman Capote's specific accusation, when it finally arrived on that Tonight Show stage, cut so completely through 17 years of professional composure that Rogers found himself doing something he had never once done in public before. Quick reminder before we continue, because this next part of the story matters enormously. If you're enjoying this so far, take just a second to hit that like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment. Because what happens on that stage in a few minutes is unlike anything Fred Rogers ever did in public again. Johnny Carson had booked both men for that evening's broadcast for entirely ordinary reasons, Capote promoting recent literary work and generating the kind of reliably entertaining, unpredictable conversation his increasingly erratic public appearances had become known for, Rogers appearing to discuss the continued success of his children's program. Carson himself had a genuine and specific fondness for Rogers that extended beyond ordinary professional courtesy, having interviewed him on several previous occasions and having come away from each conversation with a quiet personal conviction, shared privately with members of his staff, that Rogers represented one of the very few guests whose public and private selves seemed to be exactly the same person, a rarity. Carson, after nearly 2 decades of interviewing thousands of celebrities, had learned to recognize and to value considerably more than most viewers might have expected from a host whose own on-camera persona was, by his own private admission, considerably more performed than Rogers's ever was. Carson's fondness for Capote was of an entirely different character, a genuine appreciation for his literary talent combined with a wary awareness, shared by most experienced television professionals who had worked with him during this period, that his appearances carried genuine risk given his increasingly unpredictable relationship with alcohol. Carson's production team had, in fact, discussed privately before the broadcast whether pairing Capote with a guest as gentle and unguarded as Rogers represented a wise programming decision, but the pairing had ultimately been approved on the assumption that Capote's sharpest edges were typically reserved for people within his own social and literary world rather than a children's television host whose work existed in an entirely separate cultural sphere, an assumption that would prove, within the hour, to have been badly mistaken. Carson's producers considered the pairing an interesting contrast rather than a potential collision. 2 enormously different public figures whose conversation might illuminate something about the range of American celebrity, though nobody on the production staff fully anticipated the specific danger of placing Capote in the particular state of intoxication and bitterness that had come to define his public appearances by 1980, in direct conversation with a man whose entire identity rested on a sincerity Capote had spent decades learning to distrust in everyone he encountered. Capote arrived at NBC Studios that afternoon already visibly affected by alcohol, according to a production assistant present that day, a detail the staff noted with private concern but felt unable to address directly given his stature as a literary celebrity whose unpredictable talk show appearances had, perversely, become part of his continued commercial value. Fred Rogers arrived separately, composed and unfailingly courteous as always, greeting the production staff with the same genuine warmth he extended to everyone he encountered regardless of their position or importance, a consistency that people who worked with him across decades of television production repeatedly described as entirely unperformed, present in every interaction whether cameras were rolling or not. The broadcast began normally, Carson navigating between his 2 guests with his usual skillful warmth, Capote delivering several minutes of genuinely sharp and entertaining literary observation that had the studio audience delighted, Rogers offering his own segment about childhood emotional development with the quiet sincerity that had defined his program for over a decade. During these opening minutes, according to several people present, Capote seemed genuinely engaged and even charming in the specific way that had once made him one of the most sought-after guests at any gathering, telling a story about a recent encounter with a fellow writer that had the studio audience laughing genuinely, his timing and wit still fully intact despite the visible physical toll of his recent years. Rogers, watching this performance with what several people described as genuine appreciation, complimented Capote directly on his storytelling ability, a small moment of professional generosity that made what followed considerably more difficult for those present to reconcile afterward. Nothing in the broadcast's opening segment gave any indication of what was coming, and several members of the production staff later said that this made the eventual rupture considerably more disorienting, arriving without any of the escalating tension that might have prepared the room for what Capote was about to say. Roughly 19 minutes into the broadcast, Carson, attempting to generate conversation between two guests whose public personas differed so completely, asked Capote what he thought about the specific phenomenon of Rogers's program and its extraordinary success with American children. Do not miss what happens next, because it is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Truman Capote considered the question for a moment. And then, with the specific precision that had made his cruelest observations so devastatingly effective across decades of literary and social combat, said that he found the entire enterprise a remarkably sophisticated con, a grown man in a cardigan sweater manufacturing an artificial gentleness so carefully calibrated that millions of parents had been fooled into believing genuine kindness could be mass-produced and sold on a schedule, 5 days a week, packaged and monetized like any other successful commercial product. He said that real kindness, the kind that actually costs something to give, did not survive contact with a camera and a production budget, and that what Rogers had actually built was not an act of genuine care for children, but an extraordinarily lucrative performance of care, indistinguishable, in Capote's considered literary judgment, from the fraudulent sincerity of a particularly skilled con man. The studio audience, sensing the specific cruelty beneath Capote's precise and articulate delivery, went completely silent, several people visibly uncomfortable, uncertain whether they were witnessing genuine literary criticism or something considerably more personally vicious. Fred Rogers did not respond immediately. He sat for a long moment, and several people present described something shifting in his expression that they had genuinely never seen from him before, not anger exactly, but a specific and profound weariness. The visible weight of a man absorbing an accusation that had found, however unfairly, an actual and tender wound, rather than simply glancing off the professional composure he had spent decades perfecting. The show's director, watching this unfold through the control room monitors, later described the specific quality of that silence as unlike anything he had witnessed in Rogers's several previous appearances on the program, a stillness that carried genuine internal calculation rather than simply patient absorption, as though Rogers were, for the first time in the director's experience of him, actually weighing whether to respond at all rather than automatically defaulting to his usual gracious deflection. Several members of the studio audience seated close enough to see his face clearly described a specific and fleeting expression that crossed his features during the silence, something that one audience member later characterized in an interview years afterward as looking briefly and unmistakably like a much younger and more vulnerable version of the man they thought they knew. A glimpse, however brief, of exactly the lonely, sickly child whose experience had shaped everything Rogers had subsequently built his career around protecting other children from ever having to feel. Johnny Carson, sensing the genuine danger in the moment, began attempting to redirect the conversation. But Rogers, quietly and without any visible drama, stood up from his chair. He said, in a voice considerably quieter than his usual television register, that he understood Mr. Capote was entitled to his opinion, and that he had spent many years accustomed to being told his sincerity was manufactured. He paused for a moment, and when he continued, his voice carried a specific quality that several people present described as unlike anything they had heard from him in previous appearances, not raised, not angry in any conventional sense, but carrying an unmistakable and final weight. He said that he had built his entire adult life around a simple conviction that children deserved to know the difference between adults who genuinely cared about them and adults who were simply performing care for other reasons, and that he had spent nearly 2 decades trying to make sure that no child watching his program ever had to wonder which one they were actually receiving. He said that hearing this life's work reduced to a calculated con, live in front of millions of people, touch something he had not expected to find himself defending in quite this way on this particular evening in front of this particular audience. But he said that he found himself, for the first time in a very long career, simply unwilling to remain in a room where a man's genuine effort to help frightened and lonely children was being described, with such casual and articulate cruelty, as a confident scheme. He said this without raising his voice, without any visible anger, simply a quiet and final statement of fact. And then he turned and walked toward the stage exit, leaving Truman Capote sitting alone at the desk with his drink, and leaving Johnny Carson, for one of the only times in his entire broadcasting career, genuinely uncertain what to say next. The studio audience sat in a silence that several people present described as unlike anything they had experienced at a live television taping, specific and stunned quiet. 21 million Americans watching a man whose entire public identity rested on endless patience simply refuse, for the first time in public memory, to remain present for cruelty. Several audience members, interviewed by entertainment reporters in the days following the broadcast, described the specific and disorienting quality of witnessing something that felt genuinely unprecedented. A man they had watched for years demonstrate seemingly infinite patience with frightened children finally reaching a limit in front of them, live and completely unscripted. One woman, who had brought her young daughter to the taping specifically hoping to see Fred Rogers in person, said that she found herself crying quietly in her seat, explaining to a reporter afterward that watching someone she considered almost impossibly patient finally say enough had taught her daughter something she considered more valuable than any single episode of the actual program, that even the gentlest people have limits worth respecting, and that walking away from cruelty was not a failure of patience but sometimes its most honest and appropriate expression. Truman Capote, according to multiple accounts, appeared genuinely shaken by what had just occurred, his earlier cutting confidence giving way to something considerably more uncertain, the specific discomfort of a man who had spent his entire career deploying wit as a weapon, suddenly confronting the actual weight of what that weapon had just done to someone who had, by every visible measure, never done him any harm. What happened backstage in the minutes that followed has been described by several production staff members who witnessed fragments of it, though the full conversation, held privately between Rogers and a producer who followed him backstage, was never entirely reconstructed. According to the account that eventually emerged, Rogers, once away from the cameras, sat quietly in a small backstage room for several minutes before speaking at all, and when he finally did, he explained, briefly, and without excessive detail, that Capote's specific choice of the word con had struck him considerably harder than ordinary criticism ever had, because it touched directly on the exact fear that had shaped his entire childhood, the fear that adults who appeared kind might actually be performing that kindness for reasons that had nothing to do with genuine care for the children in front of them. He said that he had built his entire career specifically to make sure no child ever had to discover, the way he privately feared discovering as a lonely and frequently ill boy himself, that the warmth being offered to them was calculated rather than real, and that hearing his life's work reduced to exactly that same fraudulence, live in front of millions of people, had simply become more than he was willing to remain seated for. Johnny Carson, after a brief commercial break, addressed the audience directly when the broadcast resumed, saying, with unusual directness for his typically diplomatic hosting style, that he had known Fred Rogers for several years and considered the accusation that had just been leveled against him not only unfair but genuinely untrue, a rare moment of Carson stepping outside his customary neutrality to defend a guest who was no longer present to defend himself. Carson continued for nearly a full minute, according to the broadcast transcript preserved in NBC's archives, describing his own personal observations of Rogers across several previous appearances, noting specifically that he had, on more than one occasion, witnessed Rogers extend the exact same patient warmth to production assistants and camera operators that he displayed toward children on his own program, and consistency Carson said he had come to recognize, across nearly 2 decades of interviewing thousands of public figures, as the specific and unmistakable signature of someone whose private character matched their public presentation completely. He said that he had interviewed a great many performers whose kindness evaporated the moment the cameras stopped rolling, and that Fred Rogers was, in his own considerable experience, definitively not one of them. This unusually direct defense, delivered without any of Carson's customary comedic deflection, was itself widely discussed in the days following the broadcast. Several television critics noting that they had rarely, if ever, seen Carson abandon his professional neutrality so completely on behalf of an absent guest. Capote, for his part, attempted to continue the broadcast with his characteristic composure, but several viewers who wrote to NBC in the days following the broadcast specifically noted that something in his demeanor for the remainder of the evening seemed genuinely diminished. A man visibly aware that he had crossed a line even his own considerable skill at cruel observation had not previously located. NBC's switchboard, according to production staff who monitored it, received an unusually high volume of calls in the days following the broadcast, overwhelmingly in support of Rogers, viewers writing and calling specifically to express their belief in the genuine sincerity of his work with children and their disappointment in Capote's public cruelty toward a man who had never given anyone reason to doubt his intentions. Letters arrived at NBC's offices for weeks following the broadcast, many of them from parents, describing their own children's genuine emotional attachment to Rogers' program and expressing gratitude that someone had finally, however unintentionally, demonstrated on national television that the man they trusted with their children's emotional education possessed genuine limits and genuine feelings rather than existing as some kind of endlessly patient, faintly unreal television construct. Several letters specifically praised Rogers' decision to simply leave rather than engage in the kind of heated public argument that Capote's accusation might have provoked from a less disciplined public figure, viewers noting that the quiet dignity of his exit somehow proved the exact point Capote had tried to dispute. That genuine composure, even when finally tested past its limit, looked considerably different from performed composure that had simply never been genuinely challenged before. Fred Rogers, in the only interview where he was ever asked directly about the incident years later, declined to discuss the specific details, saying only that everyone occasionally reaches a limit they did not know they had, and that he did not regret walking away from a conversation that had stopped being about children and had become, in his considered private judgment, simply an exercise in cruelty for its own sake. There is one final detail about this story that deserves to be understood more fully, something that connects the entire arc of this confrontation back to what happened in both men's lives in the years that followed. Truman Capote's public career continued to decline in the years after that broadcast, his drinking and substance dependency worsening despite periodic and ultimately unsuccessful attempts at treatment, and he died in 1984, 4 years after that Tonight Show appearance, having never completed the novel whose earlier excerpts had cost him nearly every meaningful friendship from his years of literary triumph. Several biographers who have examined his final years specifically note the Rogers broadcast as one of a handful of public moments that seemed to genuinely trouble him afterward, a rare instance of his own cruelty producing a consequence he found difficult to simply absorb and move past, unlike the numerous other social wounds he had inflicted across his career with what appeared to be considerably less private cost to his own conscience. Fred Rogers, for his part, continued his program successfully for over 2 more decades following the incident, and in the one interview where he was asked directly about it, he added, after his initial brief response, something that several people who knew him considered deeply characteristic of the actual man behind the gentle public persona. He said that he had, in the years since, found himself thinking of Truman Capote with something closer to sadness than resentment, understanding, with the same professional insight into childhood wounds that had shaped his entire career, that a man capable of such precisely targeted cruelty had very likely suffered his own considerable and unaddressed childhood pain, and that he hoped, wherever Capote eventually found himself, that some version of the same gentleness Capote had accused him of manufacturing had found its way to him as well, genuinely, before it was too late. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to think about the moments in your own life when someone's careless words touched a wound you had spent years protecting, and about the specific courage it sometimes takes to simply walk away from cruelty rather than continuing to absorb it in the name of politeness. You do not need Fred Rogers' decades of patience to know when enough is enough. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs permission to walk away from a conversation that has stopped serving them. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about the moments when kindness finally had its limits tested and passed the test in the quietest possible way. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and telling me about a time you finally walked away from something that no longer deserved your patience.